Previously, on parts 1 and 2 of the KOFA Special. We began our trip in the south end of KOFA, camping near Castle Dome Road. We headed along a spur trail deep into the remote stretches of the Castle Dome Mountains on rugged and sometimes slow-going trails. At the end of the road, we explored the ruins of the Big Eye Mine, before backtracking to the nearest main dirt road and checking out the old mine museum. We camped near Castle Dome Peak on our way north before continuing along our route the next morning. After traversing the range, we found ourselves in the expansive King Valley in the heart of KOFA. We continued aiming northeast, eventually arriving at another pair of historic sites. Firstly, the extensive ruins of the North Star Mine, with many remnants and a fascinating history, and eventually over to the King of Arizona Mine, the namesake for the area, which had some things to look at, including some structures and a historic cemetery, although not much more since most of the area is still privately owned. After much of the day exploring the rich history of the area, we backtracked through the King Valley and to the western boundary of KOFA, where a very brief highway stretch brought us into the northern half of the range, where we were treated to some more incredible views and a lovely wide open camp overlooking it all. Today, we continue with day 3 of our trip, exploring the area around Palm Canyon. We'll take a short hike through this incredible area before continuing north to the upper end of the National Wildlife Refuge. There, we would set out on our final push across KOFA, a complete traverse from the west to our exit point in the east on a narrow and winding trail that cuts between the New Water Mountains and the KOFA Mountains. Along the way, we would be treated to more sparsely populated stretches, a unique rock collecting area, and another historic cabin, all the while dealing with the long and grueling stretches of desert trail that was taking its toll. It would be an adventure until the very last mile as we wrapped up our time in KOFA. Our third and last night of camp was relaxing and uneventful. It was calm and quiet when we awoke just a little before 7 a.m. When we made it out of the tent, the sun had risen and begun to stretch across the landscape. Our camp was still in the shadows, blocked by the nearly 5,000-foot mountain to the east, the highest point in KOFA. The gentle glow of the day slowly crept across the desert floor. It was a cool morning and required some light jackets as we got started on breakfast. We would be finishing up the last of our cinnamon rolls today and sipping on a little bit of coffee. It was a light breakfast, but certainly delicious. After some dishes, it was time to pack up camp and get rolling for the day. A simple camp breaks down pretty simply, hence the whole point. Most of the work is just reshuffling gear back into position in the Jeep. The newer lightweight kitchen setup certainly helped make things more efficient and organized on this trip. I collapsed the tent back down after it was empty, and after that, camp was pretty much reset, maybe 15 or 20 minutes later. This had been a great spot. The numerous open volcanic flats in this area provide the perfect place to set up a camp of any size, and after finding one off the beaten path that had a great view was worth the couple extra minutes of effort. With everything loaded, we returned to our normal seats and fired the Jeep up. With some road trip tunes playing and some fresh drinks in hand, it was a beautiful morning drive leaving camp. Our first stop wasn't far from here. In fact, it was a little over 5 miles to get to the base of the mountain where our hike was. After making an unplanned turn, my spidey senses started tingling and I could tell we were headed the wrong way. With a quick consult of the map and a turnaround, we were back on track. The road remained smooth and manageable, and high clearance really wasn't even needed at this point. The 2-track road was narrow but wound through the desert vegetation and through occasional washouts. The desert, once again, was particularly lush, with recent rains and mild temperatures giving reprieve to the grass and plants trying to grow. We encountered some morning rush hour traffic before making it back to Palm Canyon Road, one of the few main dirt roads through KOFA. Now headed east, the road was a very wide, standard washboard gravel road. Numerous people camp right off the road, so expect to see people on the road and moving about in this area. We meandered along the road as it continued to aim us directly toward the ever-growing mountain in front of us. Palm Canyon Road was in great shape. Recent weather had carved out a few washed out areas and holes that were marked, and other than these couple areas, this road was kept in fantastic shape as expected. Ever so slightly, we had begun to climb towards the mountain. It was hard to notice at first, but the built-up plains around the base of the mountain, called a bahada in the geomorphology world, marked the slow erosion of the KOFA Mountains. This gentle sloping area ramped us toward Palm Canyon and was strewn with tons of cholla cacti and ocotillo. The view improved as we got closer and closer, eventually reaching the end of the road at a large parking lot. The parking lot had a handful of cars as well as some informational boards talking about the geology and biodiversity of the area, as well as information about the bighorn sheep that call this area home. Looking back at the way we came, you could see just how much elevation we had gained from camp. The steep walls of Palm Canyon rose up around us. The rocks here tell the story of volcanism. According to scientists, 2 large calderas, or volcanic chambers, were formed in this area, and periods of earthquake and eruptions formed the landscape in violent fashion over the course of the last 25 million years. As we set out up the canyon, the trail climbed and remained narrow. The surface was rocky, and some good hiking boots would be a wise choice. We may have been a little overprepared, given the trail was only half a mile, but better to be safe than sorry. Interestingly enough, this half-mile trail is the only designated trail in the entire 664,000-acre refuge. Visitors are allowed to hike anywhere in KOFA, as long as their vehicle stays within 100 feet of a road. It just won't be on an official trail unless it's here in Palm Canyon. We headed deeper as the walls closed in around us. In places, the trail was a little hard to follow over the terrain, and it was steep, but overall, the half mile was a refreshing start to the day. It allowed us to explore the area in a more intimate way than we were able to cover in the Jeep. At the end of the trail, we arrived at a simple wooden sign that said palms. And this is what we came to see. No, not the sign, but what it points to. From this overlook, viewers get a glimpse of the California fan palms growing out of a narrow, rocky canyon above. The sign points where to look, and the cluster of trees seemingly clings onto the rock by a thread. According to the signs at the start, these palms are the only native palm tree species to grow in Arizona. It was the most peculiar place to find a palm tree, and it remains in shade for most of the day, which is perhaps why they thrive here. Looking back down the canyon, we were treated to another spectacular view, a reward for the additional elevation we had gained from the parking lot. Further up the canyon, Signal Peak rose up high above us. After relaxing in the shade for a moment and staring a little longer at the palm trees we came all this way to see, we turned around and headed downhill. The way back out seemed so much faster than the hike in. Not that this was a particularly long or strenuous hike by any stretch of the imagination. We enjoyed the view on our way back out, and before long, found ourselves back on the Bajada and arrived back where we started at the parking lot. Aside from visiting Palm Canyon and traversing the slightly longer route up KOFA Queen Canyon, there really isn't much more to see from this access point of KOFA. We backtracked back towards Highway 95. From here, our plan would be to once more relocate 10 miles north to the next major dirt road that cuts through the range. The drive out was uneventful and not particularly busy aside from those already camped out. Just before we reached the highway, we pulled off to air up. Why I chose to air up for this 10-mile stretch and not for yesterday's 10-mile stretch, I can't really tell you. I think the thought was maybe I could leave the tires aired up now as long as possible, perhaps to the end of the trip, unless needed later. Regardless, the tires were now back to highway pressure, and we jumped back on the blacktop once again, heading north. Throughout our trip, we had come across a wide variety of trails, from slow-going 4x4 trails to smooth, dirt superhighways. But the first few miles of pavement are always almost unbelievably smooth and quiet. Just a few minutes later, we were deviating from Highway 95 once more and turned right onto another dirt road. This one would be our last major stretch, hopefully bringing us all the way across KOFA to our exit point on the far northeastern side. The first few miles were on BLM land, but we soon entered back into wildlife refuge land. The road surface was a bit rockier, but just as wide and fast-moving as all of the other major roads through the refuge had been. On our maps was an area labeled Crystal Hill Rock Collection Area, and since we would be driving right by, we decided to stop and check out this point of interest. Crystal Hill has a small network of unofficial campsites and trails crisscrossing the area. The real draw lies just north, across the wash. The hills here are dominated by footpaths and prospect pits from people hunting for minerals to take home. Since we like rocks, we set out uphill with a rock hammer to see what we could find in this area considered to be one of a few points of interest talked about in the KOFA brochure. The area is known for its occasional nice pieces of clear quartz, which can be found in cracks and crevices of the rhyolite hills in this area. Quartz is incredibly common, in fact, the second most common mineral in the Earth's crust, so finding a hunk of it isn't that special. What is more special is the clear variety in nice crystal clusters which feature hexagonal faces. We didn't find anything like that, and if you are seeing a video or picture of what I'm talking about, it definitely wasn't found on our trip here. We swung the rock hammer a bit, exploring a few old prospect pits from past rockhounds. We did find some interesting looking quartz rocks and a little clear quartz, but nothing particularly valuable. The area likely gained notoriety due to a mining claim being filed very close by. It was called Crystal Peak and briefly worked at sourcing semi-precious gemstone pieces of quartz. It operated enough to move from prospect classification to producer, according to records, although to what extent is unknown. And according to the lack of documentation, it likely only remained a very small-scale operation. It appeared in mining documents as early as 1959 and as late as 1993. We made our way back to the Jeep after some time walking around. Before beginning on the last big push through KOFA, I wanted to air the tires back down. For the remainder of our trip, we'd be following a natural gas pipeline access road that cuts all the way across this northern stretch of KOFA. Because of this, I wasn't sure what kind of conditions to expect. I've seen some pipeline roads well maintained and others inaccessible, and decided to err on the side of caution. Also, for this reason, I decided, since we were doing vehicle maintenance things, adding my 5-gallon gas can to the tank would be beneficial. On the drive to Crystal Hill, we had approached the quarter tank mark, and since we were heading into a remote stretch of desert, seeing the gas needle a little higher would bring some peace of mind. Although we only had about 25 miles of trail in unknown condition, it was closer to 40 miles until the next known service, and that was if we could make it. After getting most of the gas into the tank and the tires brought down to a more comfortable pressure, we were ready. The Jeep fired right up, now sitting close to a half a tank of gas, and we returned to the main road and turned east. Fortunately, so far, the access road was smooth and steady. We were able to hold a good pace as we pushed deeper east. A power line followed the road in many places along this utility corridor. In some sections, caution tape marked areas where the gas pipeline was being fixed and maintained. Large holes were dug, and the replacement sections of the large pipe used underground were visible. We passed a place on the map that was marked Scott's Well, and stopped for some fun photos for no real reason before continuing on. The trail continued along, gently undulating up and down over the terrain as it went. To our left was KOFA Wilderness and stretches of the New Water Mountains wilderness area. While not all of the KOFA range is designated wilderness, 82% of it is, which can be a little confusing trying to understand the difference between land designations. After a few miles, the pipeline road suddenly switched back and began a rapid climb. The road climbs a couple hundred feet in just half a mile as it crests onto a volcanic plain as it continues east. The trail here was slightly more washed out from the steep slopes, but still pretty easy. Fortunately, the high clearance only the map had suggested for this road was holding true. From the top of the hill, black volcanic rocks dominated the terrain. Looking back to the west from where we came, we were given a tremendous view. Even though we still weren't that far from Crystal Hill, things felt so incredibly isolated and remote out here. Not many people venture on this road and see this part of KOFA. The road leveled back out and remained fast moving. The surface appeared to have been recently maintained. Every so often, signs reminded us that we were driving along a high-pressure gas pipeline buried underground. There were still a couple of wet spots in low-lying, shady areas. Some sections of road were lighter traveled than others, and there were a few minor splits where access to the pipeline had to be changed or rerouted. As we headed deeper and deeper along the corridor, the road got rougher and rockier in places. It was still pretty manageable with a careful pace, and we really hadn't needed four-wheel drive on this trail. The volcanic hills and mountains around us continued to roll by as we kept moving forward through mile after mile of desert. It wasn't quite as rugged here, but it was as equally desolate. Some incredibly long and straight stretches were interrupted only by the occasional wash crossing. Looking out at the landscape, it was crazy to think that all of this was still a part of KOFA. It's hard to comprehend just how large of an area it is, and how everything between here and the Big Eye mine was included in the refuge. A little under 20 miles from Crystal Hill, a wooden signpost and a junction pointed the way to our final stop. We turned right. As we headed southwest, the trail was narrow. The sun beat down on us, and the rising temperature made it feel warm since we had been outside all day. After a little over a mile, the abundant saguaro and brush gave way to a clearing, and as we rounded a corner, a small building came into view. This was KOFA Cabin. We parked and got out to explore this final piece of KOFA history. Built out of local basalt volcanic rock, this simple structure blends in pretty well with the barren surroundings. KOFA Cabin was on a long list of infrastructure projects built by the Civilian Conservation Corps. The CCC was a voluntary work program created by FDR's New Deal, aimed at improving the nation's natural resources in rural areas from 1933 to 1942. KOFA Cabin here was built in the late 1930s by one of these groups. Other improvements to the KOFA game range, as it was called at the time, included other cabins, earthen dams, and rock reservoirs for water management. Projects promoted visitor use and conservation of natural resources. The CCC group that built this cabin was made up of mostly young Native Americans from the nearby Colorado River Reservation. The cabin was built to last for sure, but even after nearly 90 years, it remains in great shape. The two-room structure features a large room on the east side that is open to the public. We went in to check it out.
It's decorated and everything.
Just get the lights.
Several beds, a furnace, and a shelf of extra supplies are among what's left inside. It wasn't immaculate, but it was usable. According to signs out front, the public is welcome to stay the night inside on a first-come, first-served basis. We enjoyed the shade inside and signed the guest book before shutting and securing the door. The west side of the structure featured a large garage that was locked and off limits to the public. It likely contains maintenance materials or maybe even top secret government documents like the ingredients to Dr. Pepper, but who knows. It wasn't the most impressive structure by any means, but it was a testament to the history and intrigue of KOFA. Every stop we had visited offered a different glimpse into the story of the area and the people that have passed through here before us, and KOFA Cabin was no different. Before getting underway, we enjoyed a snack and one last celebratory beer to honor getting to our last stop and having a successful trip. But that celebratory beer may have come just a little too soon. A short time later, when going to leave, there was a problem. It looked like we wouldn't be leaving anytime soon, after all. As it turns out, the Jeep really liked KOFA Cabin and didn't feel like leaving, so it refused to start. Which is a real shame because it had done so well and been so reliable this entire trip. To flop here at the end was just awful. I popped the hood and did a general overlook of all the obvious things. Nothing seemed to be broken, disconnected, or leaking. Of course, we were in a complete cell dead zone, so I hopped on the inReach to get in touch with my mechanic and let him know what was going on. Very early on, I had a pretty good inclination as to what the problem was.
The weird thing is just I don't hear the fuel priming. And so that tells me like it's got plenty of crank, it's just not getting the fuel it needs to get going. So Like, if we hear it prime, I have more confidence it will actually start.
How to go about fixing this problem, other than letting it cool off, well, that was a different story. Accessing the fuel pump in the field here wouldn't be easy, and messing around with fuel injectors or rails wasn't exactly a surefire fix either. Just a few minutes later, the sound of an engine approached. If you're going to break down in the desert, at least try to make sure it's at a fairly well-known and popular stop. The side-by-side brought Steven and Amanda, and of course their big helper, Nitro, across our path. Seeing the hood popped, they were quick to offer assistance. A few minutes later, an AEV prospector rolled up with Chet. Our new crew of friends all gathered underneath the hood, and we began to talk through potential solutions. We were in good company, and all of this had happened before I heard back from my mechanic. We kept returning to the fuel pump not priming. We looked at the manual, swapped fuses and relays, and tested a few other things in an effort to diagnose the problem. We then agreed we needed to bleed the fuel system, which sounds easier said than done. It actually was incredibly easy, simply taking a screwdriver to the fuel rail Schrader valve and carefully letting off pressure, while being extremely careful not to get fuel on the piping hot engine. It was a slow and tedious process. But after doing this, turning the key revealed that the fuel pump was now priming, and sure enough, the Jeep fired right up. Even though it didn't feel that hot out, was it possible the fuel was too hot coming into the engine to allow it to start? Either way, the overpressurized system was causing issues that were now at least temporarily resolved, and we were back running again. I made a comment to our new friends that I wish we could have met under better circumstances, and it was Chet who said, I couldn't think of better circumstances to meet. And thinking about that, it really hit home. By absolute chance, we had all ended up here at this remote cabin in KOFA, and now had a story to tell. I couldn't think of better people to run into when we needed help, and I appreciate them stopping and lending their assistance and company. From KOFA cabin, we made a beeline back to the main pipeline road. It was just a couple more miles until we reached Vicksburg Road, which would take us directly back to I-10. We reached out to let people know we were in fact okay and able to get things figured out, and tracked east. The remaining miles were more of the same, easygoing and fast-moving. We opted to not stop at all. The Jeep had done great except for that little hiccup, but we didn't want to push our luck. Vicksburg Road was a dirt superhighway as we headed due north for the highway 8 miles ahead. With the final few miles, we found ourselves at the KOFA boundary, officially leaving it after 3 wonderful days of exploring. Just before the road turned back to pavement, we aired up for the ride home. It was official now. Roughly 180 miles of dirt over 3 days through KOFA National Wildlife Refuge were in our rear view mirror. Today had certainly been unexpected and added a final element of adventure, but all in all, we were excited to have successfully completed this trip. Looking back at it, every mile of KOFA had shown us more about this great place. From the very southern reaches around Thumb Butte and the rugged interior through the Castle Dome Mountains and into the broad King Valley, to the area surrounding Palm Canyon and the northern stretches of the KOFA Mountains, the refuge is isolated and pristine desert at its finest. Our route covered some of the most important points of interest and historic places, the ruins of the Big Eye Mine, the Mine Museum, the forgotten structures of the North Star Mine and the mining camp of Polaris, of course the King of Arizona Mine and Cemetery, and smaller sites like KOFA Cabin, Crystal Hill, and even the Palms and the Forgotten Well. With seemingly unlimited great campsites and scenic views, we were downright spoiled and able to find plenty of solitude and quiet. The funny moments, the moments of slight panic and fear, and the overwhelming sense of wonder and awe allowed us to experience KOFA as it was intended. A place to encounter the desert, learn about its past, and appreciate its present. Thank you so much for watching this special, and as always, we'll see you on the next one.